Up the middle screen to Adams. Ooh, he got popped in the face.
Oh my
Mouth guard comes out and they're asking for help right away.
Jim, oh no. That looked bad.
That is a potential concussion. Let's see the back of the helmet. See how it hits right there?
He is down.
Pain.
Brain damage.
Physical sports.
Athletes. Football players.
Setback.
Hitting your head.
Scariness.
This is what comes to mind when athletes hear the word concussion.
By definition, a concussion can be a blow to the head or just a quick movement where the brain kind of sloshes around in your head and it bounces up against the skull. There can be a sort of a chemical release or stretching out and tearing of brain cells. And what happens is when you get that chemical imbalance is when those symptoms that are most commonly identified as a concussion can kind of come about until the brain heals.
The American Academy of Pediatrics has reported that emergency room visits for concussions in kids ages 8 to 13 years old has doubled, and concussions have risen 200% among teens ages 14 to 19 in the last decade.
I'm Alex Greb. I play fullback and middle linebacker.
Max Stroke. I play defensive end and offensive line. Never had a diagnosed concussion. I've never seen a professional about concussions. I think the closest I ever came was I took a hit in a practice once, and I couldn't see details for maybe 20 minutes. Everything looked blurry. Couldn't make out leaves on trees and stuff. But yeah, that's the closest I've ever come.
I've had games where I come home and I just sit on a couch and I just my head hurts, and then I try to take the day, rest the whole day, and it's gotten better after, but I've had undiagnosed concussions.
Go to the doctor.
Yeah.
Concussion effects are usually temporary, but can include headaches and problems with concentration, memory, balance, and coordination. Other symptoms usually include nausea, vomiting, slurred speech, delayed response to questions, appearing dazed and/or fatigued.
Concussions present in all shapes and forms and all sorts of symptoms that come with them, so it's just understanding that they're so big and so broad and just not trying to narrow it down to oh, you have a headache, you have a concussion. I used to think that a hit in the head is you have a concussion, but it's a lot different than that. Just one hit in the head doesn't mean you have a concussion. And I think the more I learn about it and the more I see and the more teams I work with, I understand that it's not every hit in the head is not a concussion. And the biggest thing, especially for us athletic trainers, is understanding the athletes that you work with and their personalities, because a hit in the head, obviously that's going to hurt, but not all of those result in concussions. So just knowing what your athletes like and knowing that if you see any changes in their personality, which usually comes if they seem lethargic or they seem like they're not in the right, if they're out of it, they don't look like themselves, you have to know who you're working with, otherwise you're not going to catch those signs when you could just think it's a hit to the head when it's actually a concussion. So just really understanding who you're working with, what they're like, and knowing that they're acting differently, and that's a good starting point to then be okay, let's go baseline test you for a concussion and see what we actually have here.
I went to medical school in 1976 to 1981. And after that, I did my residency and fellowship at the University of Michigan until 1986. So in the course of those 10 years, I didn't hear the word concussion more than 5 times. Now, I'm in a neurology program at Michigan and never hear that word. It's not a common term. Today, you can't turn on the TV, open a magazine or a newspaper without hearing the word concussion in sports. So it's interesting that there's been this evolution in terms of education for patients, parents, and coaches.
The damage from head injuries in football become more obvious each passing year, and not just because of the rate of concussions. It is the constant hits to the head these players take play after play.
I know when I was growing up playing football, I can think of probably a number of times where I probably had a concussion, but when I was younger, it was oh, you just got your bell rung, you'll be fine, go back in, no big deal. And nowadays, I think we have more of an appreciation just with a lot of the reports that have been coming out, things you're reading about in the NFL, for example, CTE, all of that is raising awareness for concussions. So, there is a rise, but I think it's because now we know what we're looking for.
Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, commonly referred to as CTE, is a degenerative disease of the brain found in people with a history of repetitive brain trauma. The buildup of an abnormal tau protein creates neurological and physiological changes. This protein builds up in places where it is not supposed to be in and around the brain, disrupting its functioning. In a New York Times article, Dr. Omalu, founder of CTE, wrote, "As a society, the question we have to answer is, when we knowingly and willingly allow a child to play high-impact contact sports, are we endangering that child?"
I would strongly discourage playing football, but if my kid wanted to play football, I'd have a hard time probably telling them no. You're more susceptible when you're younger to a concussion just because, again, the brain is still kind of growing and everything.
NFL players don't wear full pads more than 2 half days a week. That's it. So again, they figured something out. This is like rocket science, right? If you don't hit as much, you have fewer injuries.
A Washington Post survey of retired NFL players found that 9 in 10 players report having suffered concussions while playing, and just under half the players surveyed would recommend their kids playing football.
My name is Chris Borland. I walked away from pro football and a $2.9 million contract with the San Francisco 49ers because I didn't want to develop CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is caused by repeated brain injury. Researchers at Boston University studied the brains of 111 deceased NFL players. They found CTE in 110. CTE is a brain disease that causes depression, aggression, dementia, and in some cases, suicide. Yet for many years, the NFL denied the link. Unfortunately, the NFL isn't the only powerful player that's sidelining science. Lobbyists in many industries are paid handsomely to convince lawmakers to undermine science that protects our health. We all need to speak up and make sure that science isn't sidelined. Because when powerful interests keep science from the decision-making process, people get hurt. Join with me today to become a science champion. Our health and well-being depend on it.